Hi everyone, Sean here, and welcome to another episode of Lines in Sand. In my last episode, I promised that we would start to look elsewhere other than the Great Pyramid. And where is there a better place to start than the very next pyramid in line? Yes, the Pyramid of Khafre on the Giza Plateau, right next door to the Great Pyramid. Now, we've spoken about the Pyramid of Khafre before on this channel, albeit briefly, and we had one video out about some strange explosions that were reported inside the pyramid. But today I want to return to the pyramid and also revisit an older format of video from last year, where we analysed the entire structure of the Great Pyramid from top to bottom. Today, I want to do the very same for the Pyramid of Khafre, and to help me do this, I have printed off a copy of Keith Hamilton's excellent layman's guide to the Pyramid of Khafre. Much like his guides on the Great Pyramid or any of his other guides that I've read, to be honest, these so-called layman's guides are an absolute wealth of information for further digging, quoting many of the explorers of antiquity, and Keith adds his own reconstructions and theories too. Honestly, I cannot sing praise enough for these guides, and I implore you to read them if you haven't. So, with the very welcome assistance of these guides, let's take a deep dive into the structure of the Pyramid of Khafre, starting with the exterior. The pyramid is an imposing sight, towering over the Giza Plateau, and is often mistaken for the Great Pyramid itself. I've lost count of the amounts of articles or news reports that show pictures of Khafre's pyramid when referencing the Great Pyramid of Giza, but that's another story for another time. Khafre's pyramid dominates the skyline and from many angles appears bigger than the Great Pyramid, but it is Khufu's Great Pyramid which has the greater size. Now, I will be referring to this pyramid throughout the video as the Pyramid of Khafre, but this is purely for the sake of ease. I do not wish to offend or disparage those who do not believe that the pharaohs of Egypt were responsible for commissioning the pyramids as tombs. Come to think of it, I don't really know what else to call this pyramid. I've only ever heard it referred to as Khafre's pyramid. Keith Hamilton opens his guide with the interesting suggestion from Giulio Magli, an Italian astrophysicist and archaeoastronomer whose name I have no doubt butchered. He suggests that the pyramid may have been a second pyramid for Khufu, a twin project as it were, just like that of Sneferu before Khufu, who of course supposedly commissioned the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid of Dashur and possibly even the Meidum Pyramid. This is an interesting theory, the whole Khufu built the Khafre pyramid idea. I've never, admittedly, not come across before, and it warrants a little bit of a further investigation when I have the time. Anyway, what do we know about Khafre's pyramid then? It was first explored, at least as far as records in modern times go, by the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni. We will be hearing a lot about Belzoni and his work inside the pyramid across this video, so you are likely to become very familiar with his visit to the pyramid. Keith Hamilton reminds us, of course, as many people in my comment sections have pointed out too, in the various videos where this kind of subject crops up, the pyramid, without question, has also been entered countless times over the thousands of years that it has been standing. Belzoni only gives us the first modern account of an exploration of the Khafre pyramid. I found it funny and very interesting that Belzoni had a budget of £200 for his exploratory work in Egypt, of which 150 of was spent trying to break into the Pyramid of Khafre. Henry Salt, who Wikipedia tells me was an English artist, traveller, collector, diplomat and Egyptologist, blimey, offered to fund Belzoni's work further, but Belzoni refused. Therefore, he was unable to continue his work at Giza, mainly in the form of breaking into the third pyramid at the site, which we will analyse in yet another video, that of the Pyramid of Menkaure. I guess the remaining £50 was not quite enough to get enough workmen to bust open that final pyramid. Anyway, Keith Hamilton questions Belzoni's refusal of additional funding from a man like Henry Salt, but realistically we don't really know why he did this. It is said that Belzoni was very close to cracking the Pyramid of Menkaure before his money ran out, so you'd think that he would welcome some additional funding which would allow him and his men to complete their work, but alas, the history books say otherwise. Belzoni gives us the initial detail of the exploration of the Khafre Pyramid, but our good friends Weiss and Perring provided additional data once they had visited the structure in the 19th century. Piazzi Smith and the great Flinders Petrie also visited the pyramid in the 19th century. And finally, Mariolio and Rinaldi, always a favourite on this channel because hearing a Welshman suffer through pronouncing their names over and over must be amusing to some of you out there. Their data comes from 1966, where they visited the Khafre Pyramid. So in regards to references, Belzoni aside, we have more or less the same cast of characters who provided a lot of the same data for the Great Pyramid of Giza. If anything, this shows how drastically a more modern survey is needed of any and all of these ancient structures. The data from which we must piece together the details of these pyramids is considerably out of date and slightly contradictory in some cases. Now, if we take a look at Khafre's pyramid on the map, we can see that it is located almost exactly southwest of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Hamilton lists some of the potential reasons put forward for this kind of placement, from alignment with Heliopolis to, quote, astronomical alignments, as we have already discussed at length in the video on the Orion correlation theory by Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert. Hamilton also clarifies that one side of the site on which Khafre's pyramid was built was significantly higher than the other, which led to the removal of rock in order to level the site. Why not just place the pyramid elsewhere, on more level ground? Whatever the reason for its placement at this exact site, it was clearly deliberate and very important for the pyramid to go exactly where it still stands today. Keith includes some fantastic annotated photographs, originally from the ACIDA project, where we can see on what appears to be the side of the pyramid is actually the original bedrock line, indicating all which had been cut away, which is quite astounding when you stop and think about it. Other corners were constructed entirely of masonry, and what we can't see today is the original enclosure wall, which originally ran around the outside of the base of the pyramid. Hamilton, quoting the data gathered by Mariolio and Rinaldi, advises us that there was a 20-cubit wide courtyard inside this perimeter wall. That's just over 10 meters wide for us in more modern measurement terms. The enclosure wall itself was thought to be 8 meters high and over 3 meters wide. So this is not a joke of a wall that we're talking about here. It's no picket fence. It was a substantial construction in of itself. Mariolio and Rinaldi also noted the presence of drainage systems around the outside of the pyramid, which is an interesting discovery. Hamilton notes the observation that several people have suggested that the Pyramid of Khafre was originally intended to be much bigger than it actually is. Let me quote direct from his text here to explain this. Quote, "The pyramid contains 2 entrances, both on the north side. One exits through the superstructure, whilst the lower entrance exits through the paved courtyard. Both are displaced by about 12.45 meters east of the pyramid's north-south axis. Or to the nearest whole cubit, the passage is some 24 cubits east of the pyramid's axis." End quote. Hamilton goes on to quote from Dr. I.E.S. Edwards, who we spoke about a bit during the Orion correlation theory video. So let me once again quote from Hamilton, who in turn will lead us to Dr. Edwards. Quote, "Edwards would suggest that the lower chamber, which would be accessed via the lower entrance, was originally the burial chamber, and in order that the burial chamber be located under the pyramid apex and the entrance exit on the pyramid face, the pyramid would have to be located some 200 feet further north." End quote. And now, quoting I.E.S. Edwards directly,
"An alternative explanation would be that the first intention was to build a pyramid covering a much larger area and the northern and eastern limits were moved inwards. In either case, a possible reason for the change in plan was the discovery of a suitable rock foundation for the causeway concealed beneath the sand on a line south of the one originally chosen."
Now, this is something very interesting to think about. Could the original plans for Khafre's pyramid been to have dwarfed Khufu's previous Great Pyramid project? With the lack of complex chamber systems as we see in the Great Pyramid, less focus would have been on the internal machinations to construct such complex chambers, such as the King's Chamber, and perhaps more effort could have been given to the, dare I say, simpler task of just making the pyramid mass itself larger than its predecessor. On top of this, could it be that something as simple as a better causeway foundation scuppered these plans? An interesting proposition. The Khafre pyramid is not alone in theories regarding its original intended size. As those in at the deep end with pyramid research may have already come across, there are various extension and or larger pyramid theories in existence, mainly of course for the Great Pyramid of Giza. I've placed one of Keith's diagrams on screen now, which should hopefully clear up what we're talking about here. Above is the current size of Khafre's pyramid, and underneath is the proposed original size. Here's another one showing it from the side, which shows some of the implications around the two entrances to the Khafre pyramid. Interestingly, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass have weighed in on this enlargement theory, suggesting that if the pyramid was built at the bigger size, then the lower entrance, the one that currently exits into the courtyard, would actually exit the side of the pyramid at the same height as the current higher entrance exits the existing, smaller pyramid. Phew. The reconstruction on screen, however, shows that this would most likely be incorrect. We also have to ask why the Pyramid of Khafre has two entrances. This is not like in the case of the Great Pyramid, which has its original entrance by the chevron blocks and also the Robber's Tunnel. No, the Pyramid of Khafre appears to have two constructed entrances, both leading to different sets of tunnels. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Going back to the enlargement theory a moment, Hamilton rather sensibly points out that the enlarged pyramid would have its entrance significantly close to the ground, which would expose it to robbers and all sorts of unwanted visitors, right? Hamilton eventually suggests that there is no clear-cut evidence for a larger pyramid plan, and that he, quote, feels the balance of the available evidence, which is quite poor for the structure, tends to favour the current pyramid which we see today, and that no enlargement theory is required to explain its features, end quote. Flinders Petrie would give the pyramid a mean length of just over 215 metres, and regarding its slope, he gives the angle of 53/10, although the findings of Howard Weiss and Piazzi Smith vary slightly. The same 3-4-5 Pythagorean triangle attribute which is said about the Great Pyramid is also suggested here for the Pyramid of Khafre. And Hamilton adds that the angle equates to the ancient Egyptian measurement of seconds, totaling 5 palms and 1 digit. So going back to the base of the pyramid, remember that a great amount of work had to go in to make the ground upon which the pyramid would be built level. This work should not be underestimated, and I'm sure it was a colossal task in of itself before pyramid building could even really begin in earnest. Whereas the Great Pyramid construction was started with limestone on a flat surface, the Pyramid of Khafre had to have a base built to level out the playing field, as it were. Keith Hamilton explains it better than I can. Quote, the first casing course at Khafre's pyramid is of granite, and these sometimes large blocks have a vertical foot of varying heights. Moreover, the granite casing stones were placed on a rock foundation of varying height to compensate for the varying height of the casing stones. End quote. There is a picture on screen right now credited to the Asida project where these granite foundation blocks can still be seen today. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and Howard Weiss would suggest that 2 layers of granite base stones existed, but none of the other explorers have come to this same conclusion. In fact, Mariolio and Rinaldi took the time to write about why they did not agree with Weiss's statement. Either way, the general consensus is that there is a single layer of granite stone at the base of the Pyramid of Khafre. Now, without wanting to languish at the base of the pyramid for too long, we need to talk about some mysterious goings-on in regard to this granite layer. Supposedly, most of it was chipped away and stolen by robbers and repurposed into other buildings and what have you. I say supposedly because, well, for one, it is extremely difficult to split granite, and secondly, a lot of it was just left around the base of the pyramid anyway. Why would people take the time to chip off granite and then just leave it lying around in the sand? It doesn't quite add up. Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass have contributed to this confusion, in my opinion, by stating that only 5 granite casing stones remain in their original place. On top of this, lots of broken granite pieces have now been restored and placed back onto the pyramid. Hamilton suggests that all this loose granite knocking about could actually work in favour of Weiss's second course of granite theory. He writes that further courses would result in more offcuts of waste blocks, and he very rightly points to the base of the Menkaure pyramid for evidence that the Egyptians were more than capable of building pyramids out of granite blocks, at least in regards to working granite casings to the same equal heights. Moving up the face of the pyramid then, to the very top, we have the famous and instantly recognisable remaining casing stones still clinging to the top of the pyramid. Looking at this just fills me with anxiety, like standing beneath a great cliff, waiting for one of the stones to come loose and come hurtling down into the sand. It might have something to do with the fact that I live by a very large mountain, and when I walk my dogs I see huge boulders that have come away from the mountain face over the years and sit peacefully in the fields as a silent reminder that nature can just wipe you out at any moment. But anyway, I'm getting way off topic here. In regards to the Khafre pyramid, small piers have been put in place to support the remaining casing stones. What is very interesting, and I didn't know until I read Keith's paper, is that the limestone casing stones on the Khafre pyramid are not the same as the ones previously used on the Great Pyramid. There, fine Tura limestone was used, but here on the Khafre pyramid, Mokattam limestone is used, or at least so saith the wise Flinders Petrie. Mokattam limestone gives a grey appearance rather than the bright white of the Tura limestone. It also splinters more easily for what it's worth. When exactly this Mokattam casing was removed from the pyramid is uncertain, but Petrie is said to have found a coin at the southeast corner of the pyramid depicting Sultan Hassan, dated to a 14-year period in the 14th century. Interestingly, also from Petrie's accounts, we can glean recollections from late 16th century travellers that the pyramid's casing stones remain largely intact. Although just after the turn of the 17th century, reports indicate that it had been removed or had fallen away. Of course, it's not possible to verify this information, but it is interesting nonetheless. Compared to its neighbour, the Great Pyramid, the exposed core building blocks making up the Khafre pyramid's main mass seems much more untidy and ravaged by the elements over the passing years. Despite this, however, directly below the casing stones, still clinging to the top of the pyramid, however, we can seem to see steps of core masonry, which are much more clearer in definition. So it's odd that most of the pyramid's face is a rocky mess, whilst further towards the top, the structure and its stones seem in much better condition. Lena and Hawass offer that the rough surface we see today is due to the remains of packing material left strewn on the pyramid's four faces, and originally this sat between the core masonry and the Mokattam limestone casing. Mariolio and Rinaldi, on the other hand, have a similar suggestion, but instead attribute the detritus to remains of stones that have fallen away, rather than a packing material of sorts. The account of John Perring indicates that at the peak of the pyramid, a flat platform of approximately 9 square feet can be found. Sockets in place on the stones here may indicate how the now missing pyramidion was anchored in place. Keith, however, kindly takes time to do the math, explaining that if a pyramidion fitted exactly onto the currently exposed 9 square feet platform, having an ancient Egyptian measurement of 5 cubits squared, this would result in an oversized pyramidion stone. This isn't necessarily an issue, but it does raise the question of how such a large stone could have been elevated to that position, although that question also stands for the Great Pyramid's pyramidion. I'll quote Keith directly here. Quote, "If we assume a pyramidion with a height of 2 cubits, being 1.05 meters, its base would be 3 cubits, that being 1.57 meters, with a volume of 0.86 cubic meters. We do not know what material the pyramidion was made of, but if we take granite at 2,700 kilograms per cubic meter, we are looking at a pyramidion of some 2.3 metric tons. This may seem like a daunting task to place such a weight, but the granite pyramidion found at the Black Pyramid had a base of some 1.87 meters and a height of 1.31 meters, or 1.53 cubic meters, or over 4 metric tons." End quote. Anyway, with that said, let's move on and take a look inside the Pyramid of Khafre. The substructure. We can see from Perrin's diagrams here a rough layout of the entire internal system of corridors. You will notice from the side view that there are two original tunnels, which from the off is a very interesting feature. From the top view, we can see a series of quote-unquote robbers' tunnels which were dug over the years. There are some interesting deviations here which may have come after the original cut path, but just like the Great Pyramid and the Mystery of Al-Mamun's tunnel, the path taken here for the Khafre robbers' tunnel is also suspiciously specific. Once again, the penetrators either were extremely, incalculably lucky in their guesswork, or they had previous knowledge of where exactly to dig their tunnel. Despite these additional amateur tunnels and the initially perplexing presence of two entrances, you will no doubt immediately notice that the interior of the Khafre Pyramid is considerably more straightforward than that of the Great Pyramid next door. Hamilton recounts some of the horrors of constructing the Great Pyramid King's Chamber, referencing the movement and settlement of the blocks there, which may or may not have resulted in the very worrying cracks in the King's Chamber's ceiling. Perhaps then, the builders of the Khafre Pyramid opted for far less stressful building plans, pun definitely intended. Regarding the two entrances on Khafre's pyramid, however, Keefe puts it perfectly here, quote, "The design of Khafre's substructure appears illogical. We have two entrances which lead to two chambers, and because they are connected, it took only one entrance to be discovered to render the security of the other as superfluous." End quote. What then was the purpose of these two entrances and corridors? We should maybe study them a little more closely and try to find out. The topmost upper passage appears to have been constructed out of granite masonry, which again, aside from the previous pyramid's King's Chamber, is not something that we find in the Great Pyramid. This sloping corridor of granite here ends with a portcullis system, also made of granite stone. Again, going back to the suggestion that the builders greatly simplified their approach to pyramid building this time, the resulting horizontal corridor that ensues past the granite portcullis is cut from the bedrock itself and finished with additional masonry stones. But again, referencing these diagrams by Perrin, we're going to be seeing these a lot, you can see that a lower corridor cut further down in the bedrock rises and meets this upper horizontal passageway. Despite the relatively simple design of Khafre's pyramid so far, this particular junction is a bit more complex. Hamilton writes, quote, "Because we have a connecting passage from the lower chamber merging through the floor of the long horizontal passage, we have a large void in the floor of some 4.72 meters, which would need to be bridged if a funerary procession was to enter by the upper entrance. At this junction, no post holes are to be found in the walls to create such a bridge. We could argue that the procession could transit through the lower passage, but then why build the upper entrance, knowing that it would be made redundant? Indeed, why was it necessary to connect the two passages? Security would be better improved if the ascending passage from the lower chamber was omitted. The upper corridor would have been intact, allowing a procession, whilst if only one entrance was discovered, at least one chamber would escape the attention of the robbers. The apparent illogical layout raises more questions than answers." End quote. One does have to wonder if the layout of the passageways here has any bearing on the theory we mentioned earlier about the pyramid perhaps originally being designed to be much bigger. Is it possible that the lower passage was the original entrance, built to the original pyramid specification, and that the upper passage came with a change of plan? I'm just speculating here, of course. Going back to Perrin's diagram, the other major part of the substructure is of course the so-called burial chamber at the corridor's end. This one has no fancy name like King's Chamber or Queen's Chamber, but a granite sarcophagus sunk into the floor at the far western end of the chamber has earned it the title of Burial Chamber. As always, just a quick reminder, my videos are always from the widely accepted default viewpoint that the pyramids were built as tombs, and I will continue to use the phrase burial chamber here on out. But this does not mean that I dismiss any alternative thoughts or theories. Please always feel free to reach out in the comments with your thoughts or ideas. But yes, this so-called burial chamber, much like the corridor leading to it, is hewn from the bedrock beneath the pyramid, and then the walls are plastered to give an even, smooth finish. Give or take a small portion at the eastern end of the chamber by the entranceway and the sunken granite sarcophagus too, the chamber is then paved with limestone slabs and topped off with a pent ceiling also constructed out of massive limestone blocks. There are some very interesting sunken sections in the north and south walls of the chamber, which greatly resemble the shaft entrances in the Great Pyramid. We will touch on this again, though, in a short while. Quickly then, let's zoom back up the corridor a ways and take a look at the lower corridor. This one also has a granite portcullis, like its higher placed sibling. It does, however, have some additional features. I quote Keith, "Midway along the lower horizontal passage, an opening on the west wall leads down into the lower chamber. An excavation on the east wall appears to act as a turning space. This chamber is a wholly rock-cut chamber," end quote. So, this is basically the overview of the interior, right? So let's take a look at all of these components individually in a bit more detail. For now, let's take a closer look at the finer points of the upper entranceway and its granite portcullis. So returning to this portion of the pyramid, we can also see the presence of some robbers' tunnels. Whilst a bit more haphazard than the one present on the Great Pyramid, as I said earlier in the video, the similarities between the two are present in the fact that both tunnels seem to know exactly where they were going. Here, as with the Khufu pyramid, the robbers' tunnel does not seem to be a random attempt to breach the pyramid, what with one of the excavated passages very conveniently turning direction and circumventing the portcullis present in the upper entrance passage. We do not know who made this breach or breaches, but like Al-Mamun, the offender seemed to possess previous knowledge of the interior of the pyramid. Granted, Khafre's pyramid is much more simple in design, and it was perhaps much easier to assess what exactly was needed to penetrate further inside, but the point still stands. It's also worth noting that the robber's tunnel is much more precarious than the one in the Great Pyramid. Whether this is due to more careless excavation or looser filling in the pyramid itself, or perhaps both, I'm not sure. Here's an excerpt from the account of Giovanni Belzoni regarding the state of the tunnels.
To introduce many men to work in this place was dangerous, for several of the stones suspended above our heads were on the point of falling. Some were suspended only by their corners, which stuck between other stones and with the least touch would have fallen and crushed anyone that happened to be under them. I set a few men to work, but was soon convinced of the impossibility of advancing any further in that excavation.
We have to consider what drove the desire to excavate such a perilous tunnel. The original entrance doesn't seem to show any evidence of being sealed, although it may have been obscured by sand, but either way, there's the matter of the portcullis that is encountered a ways down the passage. In modern times, the passage is of course clear, but Keith Hamilton asks the question, as I'm sure many have before him, about whether the tunnel was originally blocked in a manner similar to the Great Pyramid, filled up with plugstones to stop would-be robbers from entering. There were plugstones found in the lower entrance passage, which we will get to momentarily, and this led some, such as John Perring, to conclude the same for the upper passage too. Mariolio and Rinaldi, however, in a study of the upper passageway's walls, found that this was not likely, but did not rule out the possibility altogether. Another question of value is, why is the robber's tunnel so far from the actual upper entrance? The tunnel begins some ways from the entrance and over 8 meters above the pyramid's base. This caused a very surprising conclusion from Mariolio and Rinaldi, in my opinion. Quote,
"The tunnel forced in masonry seems to have been made by thieves who did not know either where the original entrance was or how to find it."
Keith Hamilton seems to disagree, as do I, to be fair. He points out that the core masonry, as we mentioned in passing a little earlier, is looser in the Khafre and Menkaure pyramids than compared to that of the Khufu pyramid. Let's not forget Belzoni's account from a few minutes ago, where he addressed the precarious nature of cutting through such assemblies of stone. However, Hamilton does point out that Wile E. Coyote, Howard Weiss, would have faced the exact same conditions during his gunpowder days, yet was able to create a tunnel in both Menkaure's pyramid, as well as the smaller Giza G3B pyramid, seemingly without being crushed by falling rocks. We also do not know how old the Khafre pyramid robber's tunnel is. There is the possibility that it is thousands and thousands of years old, and could be in a far worse condition nowadays, or for Belzoni 2 centuries ago, than it was in its original form. Belzoni was later able to uncover the original entrance, which was covered at the time by debris and sand, by observing the Great Pyramid and comparing roughly where the entrances lay, slightly off-centre towards the east on both pyramids. I feel like I can still hear the collective sigh of relief from his men echoing through time, happy with not having to return to working inside the collapsing robbers' tunnel. The upper entrance passageway then, as we briefly mentioned earlier, was constructed from granite rather than the usual limestone. Now, I can't find a good reason for this, and perhaps someone smarter than me can suggest why, but the floor, the walls, and the ceiling of the passage were assembled from granite blocks. Some of these ceiling blocks in particular are enormous in size. Interestingly, from the account of Flinders Petrie, we can learn that the granite in the passageway here is not like the polished smooth granite of the Great Pyramid, but rough and instead finished with plaster. It was also originally painted red. The dimensions of the passageway, despite its different construction material, is much the same standard as other cramped pyramid tunnels, being 2 cubits wide and a little over 2 cubits high, with an additional 2 palms of height. This pure granite construction continues down the passageway until it levels out at the portcullis, and then it continues for 1 metre further before transitioning to limestone instead. We can see the cutoff of granite here on this diagram by John Perring. We can also see in this diagram where the robbers' tunnel terminates in the upper corridor. As I said, they very clearly knew where they were going. You can also see in this diagram the line of the bedrock. At this point, the corridor is being hewn from the rock itself, as we mentioned earlier. The portcullis, too, is cut out of a trench into the bedrock. Interestingly, when Belzoni first came upon the portcullis, the stone had been raised 8 inches above the ground. Also, taking this bedrock line into account, Keith does propose that this may be an explanation for the odd placement of the robbers' tunnel. It would have been significantly easier, if not somewhat more dangerous, for the diggers to cut through the loose limestone filler stones of the pyramid's superstructure than it would have been to cut through pure, solid bedrock. The robbers' tunnel may have started up so high off the ground to minimise the amount of bedrock being cut through. From Perrin's diagram here, we can see that interaction with the masonry meets the carved bedrock is minimal. It may have been a precarious and dangerous path, but the robbers' tunnel circumvents both the granite and the bedrock, so perhaps it is not as silly as it first appears. Another feature of note here, where the granite levels out and transitions to limestone, is a decorative stone feature called a torus. In this small drawing by Petrie, he calls it a section of rollover. A symbolic meaning has been attributed to this, but it's pretty thin. Mariolio and Rinaldi suggest that it is a feature that was meant to obscure the sharp lower edge of the first ceiling block of the horizontal passageway after the downward granite passage terminates. Keith, however, in his paper, admits to siding with the symbolic route, arguing that simpler solutions could have been put in place to eliminate a sharp edge. From Petrie's diagram, I found it difficult to place the torus, but this diagram by Mariolio and Rinaldi gives us a better understanding of where it is placed, and I can absolutely see Keith's point. Keith provides a further picture of the torus credited to Charles Regano. Now, the conflicting ideas around the torus leads nicely into this next point, that being the various surveys of the Khafre pyramid over the years vary somewhat in their measurements and details. For example, Perrin gives the upper passageway height of being 1.19 metres tall, where Mariolio and Rinaldi give the figure of 1.32 metres tall. Now, before we move further along this passage, let's look at the lower entranceway. This one, Hamilton reminds us, wasn't broken open by Belzoni and his men. He could see it from the inside, of course, even identifying the lower passageway's portcullis to have been dismantled or removed, but he could not get to the entrance. It was Howard Weiss who eventually cleared the entrance in the courtyard in the year 1837. This account from John Perring should give us a bit more of an idea why Belzoni was unable or unwilling to unblock the lower passageway.
The lower passage was opened in April 1837. It was an excavation in the rock, and the entrance was concealed by the pavement at a distance of 36 feet from the base of the pyramid. The whole length of the descending passage had been completely filled with huge blocks, which exactly fitted the aperture and were laid in cement. The one near the entrance of the pavement was 10 feet in length, and the rest were of great size.
Keith raises a point that I did not consider. Was the pavement intact above the blocked entrance? Did Weiss remove a pavement stone in the courtyard in order to identify a descending passage? From Weiss's own account, it does point to this being the case. Quote,
"The pavement at that place did not appear to have been attempted, notwithstanding that the existence of a lower entrance must have been manifest to all who examined the interior of that building."
Was Weiss trying to point out how odd it was that nobody had visibly had a go at opening the pavement entrance? We can only, unfortunately, speculate. Either way, Weiss employed his favourite tool, explosives, in dispatching with the plug-in stones, and finally the lower passageway was cleared. It is at this point in the excellent layman's guide that Keith asks a very important question. Why didn't the robbers just do this? I'll quote directly here. Quote, "The question arises as to why the robbers would not take this route to violate the pyramid. If they were acquainted with the layout of the pyramid, then they would surely have been aware of it, and removing some 30-odd metres of limestone plugs would appear easier work than the tunnel which was cut through the superstructure. The granite portcullis at its end was no barrier, as they merely had to cut into the softer bedrock to circumvent it or lever it up. In some ways, the lower entrance appears alien to the pyramid. The upper passage, built of hard granite, and likely plugged for some length of the same stone, is a serious obstacle to get over, and yet this hard work is rendered superfluous by the creation of the lower passage. And yet this lower passage was not breached. Either the robbers were unaware of the lower passage, or it was easier to cut through the superstructure, both of which seem unlikely." End quote. And these couple of paragraphs are, I think, indicative of the issues that affect the whole Khafre pyramid, rather than just the two corridors. This whole thing, despite being a fairly simple layout in comparison to its slightly larger neighbour, is a contradictory mess the more you look at it. If there was rhyme and reason to its construction and layout, which you would be partial to considering due to the sheer scale of these projects and the skill involved in bringing them to life, but if there is a complete and total plan here at the Khafre pyramid, incorporating everything with a viable explanation for each and every feature or facet, then it is not one that is immediately obvious. In fact, it is suggested perhaps that the original plan for the pyramid did not include the lower passage, and that it was a later addition to the pyramid. But why? An interesting observation in this regard is the presence of so-called skid poles. This refers to two grooves cut into the rock, in this case by the lower entranceway. Keith Hamilton points out that this is a common feature in Middle Kingdom pyramids that would come later, but not on other Old Kingdom structures like those on the Giza Plateau, except here, of course, in this very instance. Could this mean that the lower passageway was a potential later addition to the pyramid? It's an interesting suggestion. Either way, let's take a look inside this lower passage. Let's go a bit further down. At the end of the plugged descent, the amount of which was plugged is also questioned, but let's look past that for now. Where the portcullis would have sat, right? This is certainly a strange excavation, and little usable data about it exists. Infinite props to Keith then for putting together his own diagram of the lower passageway portcullis from tourist photos. Mariolio and Rinaldi put the height of the excavation for the portcullis at 2.85 metres tall. It is, however, thinner than the upper entrance portcullis at only 33 centimetres thick. I say only 33 centimetres, that's still a hell of a portcullis. Due to the placement and dimensions and the required size for the stone that would fit, there's some questions over how the stone would have even gotten into its place. Hamilton explains how the ceiling here of the descending passage would stop such a block from clearing the bend. Flinders Petrie, however, had his own ideas about the lower chamber's portcullis. Quote,
"This passage was closed by a granite portcullis, and it's important to observe how this was introduced. The block of granite was taken along the passage from the southward on edge, and the wall was cut away on one side in a slope, so as just to allow for the block being turned flat across the passage by slowing it around in a complex way. The block was then pushed up into the groove, cutting the rock for it, and the cutting in the side required to get in was filled up by masonry as the back of the block. Thus, to anyone forcing entrance, nothing but rock and the granite slab would meet them. The skill required to turn over and lift such a block in such a confined space is far more striking than the moving of much larger masses in the open air, when any number of men could work on them. By measuring the bulk, it appears that the portcullis was nearly no tons in weight, and would require 40 to 60 men to lift it. The space, however, would not allow of more than a tenth of that number working at it, and this proves that some very efficient method was used for wielding such masses, quite apart from the mere abundance of manual force.
End quote. Keith suggests that the corner of the descending passage ceiling would need to be pared back in order to allow the granite portcullis stone to pass through, but it is not conclusive that the damage in this area was inflicted upon the ceiling stone to make way for the portcullis stone, or whether it occurred at a later date. There is then the question of how the portcullis stone was held in place. This series of diagrams by Uvo Holscher, apologies for the pronunciation of that name, which is no doubt incorrect, does a great job here of showing how this could work. There was also very likely to be the presence of crossbeams, similar to what Keith has kindly demonstrated for us here in another one of his reconstructions. Then, of course, there is the matter of why go through all of this effort to place a granite portcullis in a tunnel made of limestone, which means it would be fairly easy to just tunnel around the granite portcullis. However, it is worth noting that in this case, that has not happened, and on top of that, the portcullis stone itself is missing. Let's move further along the lower passage from the mystery of the portcullis to another unusual feature, the lower chamber. Past the portcullis, the usual pyramid tunnel dimensions change. The width remains the same, but the height of the passage increases to 1.8 metres, at least according to the accounts of Howard Weiss. Along the western wall of the somewhat enlarged portion of the corridor is a doorway that leads to a lower chamber that is 10 metres long and 3 metres wide, give or take. Interestingly, at the top of the corridor down to this chamber, opposite its door in the lower passageway, is a turn-in space. The corridor leading down to the lower chamber again is the usual cramped pyramid tunnel dimension, matching that of the descending passageway to the portcullis. So, what was the purpose of this chamber? Mariolio and Rinaldi cite evidence of a door having existed at the chamber's entrance, and Petrie took the time to calculate what sizes of coffin or sarcophagus could fit into the chamber, taking into account the turn-in space and tunnel dimensions. Mariolio and Rinaldi also inform us that the workmanship on the tunnel descending to this lower chamber is of fairly low quality compared to other tunnels of a similar design. From the pictures in the Layman's Guide credited to Charles Regano, we can see some very interesting carvings in the penned roof of the chamber. Flinders Petrie would make the following observations in this regard.
The lower chamber is also plastered, and is cut very roughly in some parts. On the roof, even 6 inches too much having been taken off, and then plastered up. The great deficiency is, however, the same on both sides of the roof, and it looks as if some different form had begun, and then abandoned.
Some very interesting observations are made regarding this lower chamber. Both Belzoni and Perring would comment on the presence of, quote, small blocks of stone, end quote, inside the chamber, but Petrie's account omits these. Furthermore, Belzoni would report potentially Coptic inscriptions on the walls, but these two are no longer visible and are not mentioned elsewhere. Perring would write about evidence of rainwater penetrating the chamber up to 12 inches worth from reference marks on the chamber's walls. There is also evidence of water erosion damage in the ascending part of the lower passage that leads to the upper passage, which we will get to in a moment, with Keith reminding us at this point that any water that would have made its way down to this passageway and into this chamber would have come from the breached upper passageway or through the robber's tunnel, rather than through the sealed lower passageway and its plugstones. From the corridor with the lower chamber, the lower passageway then turns upwards at an inconsistent angle to meet the upper passageway. Like everything else in this at first seemingly simple laid out pyramid, it contains a lot of its own mysteries. The most glaringly strange feature of this part of the pyramid has to be the area marked with the B here on this diagram from, I believe, Howard Weiss. This section was hidden under a masonry floor from the upper passageway perspective, and is visible through a hole in the ceiling of the ascending part of the lower passageway also. In fact, this portion of the pyramid was missed entirely by Belzoni, and was only recorded for the first time by Weiss and Caviglia during their visit to Giza in 1837. But what could be the purpose of such a perplexing excavation? As Keith so eloquently puts it, quote, "I could find no detailed images looking inside the void, as this area is off limits to tourists, so it's hard to come to any conclusions as to its function." End quote. It was suggested by Mariolio and Rinaldi that the excavation was the beginning of the work to create the ascending part of the lower passageway. But errors were made in calculating where the ascending passageway was required to be placed, and the work was abandoned in favour of the correct placement for the ascending portion that we now see today. Gilles Daumion, and a person whose name I am absolutely going to massacre right now, that being Jean-Yves Verheurt, suggested that the void was carved out with the purpose of sliding another portcullis into place halfway up the ascending part of the lower passageway. This actually makes a lot of sense, as the theory about them making an error and digging the tunnel in the wrong place doesn't seem very plausible to me, but I guess it is possible. However, regarding Daumion and Verheurt's portcullis theory, Hamilton raises the point of how difficult, potentially impossible even, it would have been to get the right-sized portcullis stone into the position required, even with the assistance of this strange tunnel to lower it into place. There's also a severe lack of grooves in the floor or walls or guides for the portcullis stone to slide into. If this indeed was the purpose of the excavation, then it is not entirely clear, and it lacks supporting evidence, or any evidence at all. Keith Hamilton has the interesting suggestion that the excavation could have been for some sort of intrusive burial. To support this idea, he references the various intrusive burials in the pyramid of Amenemhat III. Probably messed that up as well, sorry. There's also the case that later burials seem to take place in the main chamber of the Khafre pyramid, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here once again. The true purpose of this strange excavation then, for now, remains an unsolved mystery. It is at this point that the upper and lower passageways awkwardly converge, made even more complex by the inclusion of this mystery excavation. Truly, it is a mess, with the robbers' tunnel coming in from the ceiling, and today ladders span the mystery void. Here's a very interesting photograph looking north, where both the upper and lower passageways can be seen. It is one of the clearest photos that I have seen of the interior of the Khafre passageways from modern times. Now, from this point onwards, the tunnel to the main burial chamber at nearly 40 meters in length is fairly uneventful, at least compared to the rest of the pyramid's network of tunnels. There is a small breach in the rock on the east wall, but as with pretty much everything else in the construction leading up to the burial chamber, its purpose or function is a true mystery. Another interesting feature of the horizontal tunnel leading to the burial chamber is the results of microgravimetric scans reported in Daumion and Verheurt's 2018 book entitled La Chambre de Khéphren, which seems to indicate the possibility of a hidden tunnel and chamber present underneath this portion of the horizontal passage. Now, this is a very tantalizing proposal indeed, and whilst no work has begun to confirm the existence of these chambers, you can find more information about these potential voids either by reading the previously mentioned book, which is available online, or you can watch an excellent video by the Ancient Architects channel, who covered this subject in a quick video lasting about 10 minutes or so. You should definitely give it a watch if you are interested in these potential chambers. As they're not officially a part of the Khafre pyramid interior, however, I will omit them from this review of the structure, but please check out the two sources above for more information. The only thing left at this point to discuss is the main event of the pyramid's interior, and that is, of course, the so-called burial chamber. 14.5 meters long, a smidge under 5 meters wide, and with 5.2 meter high walls, the central room of Khafre's pyramid is no small feat. It is capped off with a saddle vault ceiling that looks enormous. As we mentioned towards the start of the video, the chamber seems to be carved from the bedrock itself, with the roof then placed on top, ready for the pyramid's superstructure to be built above it. Originally, it seems paving ran the length of the chamber, level with the sunken sarcophagus in the floor at the western end of the chamber. There are holes in the north and south walls, high in the faces, which resemble the shaft entrances in the Great Pyramid's chambers, as we've discussed, but unfortunately, these do not go anywhere exciting. These holes were the first thing that caught my eye when I first studied the interior of the Khafre Pyramid, and it baffled me that there was so little information on them, to the point where I was thinking, can I just get on a plane, get inside there with a selfie stick and hold a camera up and peek inside? As Hamilton points out in his guide, however, the holes line up rather nicely where two types of flooring inside the chamber change. Is it possible that these two holes held a supporting beam which supported some sort of wall or covering? On top of that, any shaft systems would interfere with the placement of the saddle vault ceiling, which can be seen in this diagram here. And in another shout out to ancient architects, Matt has recently, in the last year or so, I think, uploaded another excellent video that deep dives into these shaft-like holes, if you are interested in looking into them further. But for the purposes of this video, the long and short of it is that they're not shafts, and they do not go off deeper into the pyramid like the Great Pyramid equivalents. That is not a very exciting conclusion to these ominous-looking holes. Alas, it appears to be the reality of the situation. In the account of Mariolio and Rinaldi, they write of red lines running along the walls. These are no longer visible today, but may have given some clue to the true purpose of the holes in the north and south wall. Hamilton suggests that the unfinished nature of these red construction lines, the presence of the holes that we just discussed, and the absence of any finished partition points to a possible later addition to the pyramid. We need to consider as well that the burial chamber was likely finished first and then buried beneath the superstructure of the pyramid as construction continued upward. This only strengthens Keith's point, in my opinion. So, what other features are there of the burial chamber of Khafre's pyramid? Famously, nowadays, there is the graffiti placed upon the wall by Belzoni after he had uncovered the chamber. But what is not visible in modern times is the presence of supposed Arabic characters scrawled onto the chamber walls. These would have been great evidence for earlier breachers or explorers of the pyramid before Belzoni. But Belzoni's accounts mention that the Arabic characters apparently seem to have been written in some sort of charcoal, whose dust came away at the touch. By the time later explorers and surveyors took to investigating the interior of Khafre's pyramid, these characters were gone, seemingly lost to time. However, I was able to get a translation of these on Reddit, thanks to a picture in the Layman's Guide. Thanks to Redditor Klutzy Impress 4310, we now have a stab of what this could have said. I'm not going to say this out loud because I will probably butcher it, but here is a potential translation of what those characters once said. Interestingly, in the southwesterly corner of the burial chamber, there is a damaged section in the top corner where the wall meets the pent ceiling. You can thank Perring for this hideous excavation, but he seemed to give up fairly quickly and not go any further. Belzoni, when he initially breached the pyramid in 1818, reported a painted ceiling, but there has been no further evidence of this being in place, so I'm not really sure what all this was about. Keith Hamilton has a diagram in his paper that places the burial chambers of both the Khafre and Menkaure pyramids side by side. Whilst they have their differences, which we will explore more in depth whenever we get around to doing a video on the Menkaure pyramid, I'll see you again in 3 years, they also are very similar in regards to the placement of the sunken sarcophagus at the far western end of the chamber. Calling this area of the Menkaure pyramid a straight-up burial chamber is a bit strange, but again we'll cover that in more depth in another video. I mean, it does have a sunken sarcophagus, so I can't really argue with that, at least. As well as the sarcophagus, both chambers have their entrances at the exact same place, and the very odd descending passage inside the floor of Menkaure's chamber was the inspiration for Perring and his men removing the stone pavement from inside Khafre's chamber in search of further chambers in the bedrock below. Alas, they did not find any, but let's not forget those microgravimetric scans we mentioned earlier. Maybe one day something will be unearthed. Who knows? Anyway, the sunken sarcophagus, the central feature of the burial room, arguably is a strange construction. Off-centre and cemented inside a rougher granite block itself, mortared to the floor. What is interesting here in comparison to the far more studied Great Pyramid sarcophagus is that the lid is still present and mostly intact. Hamilton includes a very detailed account from Flinders Petrie regarding the properties of the sarcophagus and its lid, and if you're interested in the finer details, properties of the stone, drill marks and what have you, I would direct you to give it a thorough read. I won't repeat it here as it's a great wall of text that would take me a few minutes to read. It isn't a quick quote to prove a point, but definitely open up the Layman's Guide PDF or consult Petrie's own work for the full account. Regarding the lid, aside from the damage afflicted to it by whoever removed it from its original resting place, it appears to be in great condition. Hamilton collects a series of odd reports from reputable sources such as Dr. I.E.S. Edwards, Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, who all purport the lid to have been severed in 2 pieces by robbers of antiquity. And this is how Belzoni found it to be in 1818. However, we can clearly see that the lid is a completely whole, solid piece of granite, which is interesting to say the least. What's also interesting is in Belzoni's first examination of the sarcophagus, he wrote off its contents as being only rubbish and stones, and it wasn't until the next day that some bones were found in the sarcophagus. After being sent off for analysis, it was confirmed that these bones were from that of a bull, and not a human being. We have discussed ceremonial bull burials before on the channel, as well as a wide host of other animals from ibis birds to dogs. So, there are a few questions here. Who, if anyone, was originally buried in the sarcophagus? Belzoni found it half open, so it had clearly been breached before his time. Was a pharaoh ever buried here, Khafre or otherwise? The next question is who buried this bull, and when? In other ceremonial bull burials, they were mummified and buried mainly in the Saqqara region. So what is the significance of this one at Giza? In a pyramid, no less. Was it once mummified? If the bull was placed here in the empty sarcophagus, then what happened to the buried pharaoh? Much like the Great Pyramid, the absence of any discovery whatsoever of Khufu, or in this case Khafre or Khafra, or any of his effects, is one of history's greatest mysteries. My 4-year-old son asks me every so often, "Dad, have they found the mummies yet from the pyramids?" And I always say, "No, son, they haven't. Nobody knows where they are." To which he often replies, "But where have they gone then?" I must say that I share his frustration. Finally, and perhaps not as tantalizingly, but what is the pile of earth and stones found inside the sarcophagus along with the bones? Had someone been digging or excavating inside the chamber? Why had the coffer been filled with the dirt and stones? All of this is very strange, and in typical ancient Egyptian fashion, it is very unlikely we will ever be able to answer these mysteries at all. Hamilton writes, actually, that the evidence for a bull burial is rather superficial. And he's right. It's not like we found an entire mummified bull carcass or even an intact skeleton in the sarcophagus. Just a few bones, and even just some pieces of bones. I share also in Keith's frustration at the fact that bones were sent to London for analysis. So where are they now? Surely they should have been kept as a find of some significance. Interestingly, Hamilton states that the sarcophagus would not fit down the passageway in Khafre's pyramid. Its dimensions mean that turning it on its side could allow its passage down the narrow tunnels, but how likely would this be if there was a dead king inside it? It cannot be ruled out, though, that the sarcophagus was dropped into its place before the pyramid superstructure itself was built, before the roof went onto the burial chamber, and it was just a rectangular excavation in Giza's bedrock. The sarcophagus could have been lowered into the chamber safely, the saddle vault ceiling erected, and the pyramid then built on top of it. And that's it, more or less, he says 1 hour into a video, at least from a nice overview perspective of the whole Khafre pyramid. Due to the sheer size of this construction, it is often tempting to let our minds wander to the possibility of other chambers existing inside the pyramid's superstructure. Let's not forget, pretty much everything we have talked about in today's video has been below ground. With the sheer size of the pyramid, and of course the knowledge of the Great Pyramid next door having all of these complex internal passageways inside the core of the pyramid, it is hard to accept the fact that the Khafre pyramid superstructure may be completely empty. Scan Pyramids, who have caused such a stir with their Great Pyramid discoveries, have indeed scanned the Khafre Pyramid and have found no evidence of voids up inside the Khafre Pyramid superstructure, which may seem disappointing, but we have to remember the reason why the Great Pyramid draws so much attention compared to many other pyramids, this one included. A part of that reasoning is because it is the exception to the rule. Most, not all, but most pyramid chambers are below ground, and if they are above ground, they're not really to the level of complexity of the Great Pyramid. In my opinion, its existence and its close proximity to Khafre's pyramid makes it quite hard to accept that its giant neighbour does not appear to have secret passageways and chambers in its huge superstructure. But aren't the existing excavations under Khafre's pyramid puzzling enough? The design of the interior of Khafre's pyramid makes so little sense to me, even after reading such an in-depth analysis. So let's open the floor. What do you think of Khafre's pyramid? Is there a purpose to the dual entrance model? What of the lower chamber, once potentially flooded with water? What of the sunken sarcophagus and its mysterious set of bull bones, the precarious robber's tunnel, or the unusual excavation between the upper and lower tunnels? Please let me know your thoughts if you have any. I'll pop in one final reminder to please go and read Keith Hamilton's Layman's Guides. They are truly fantastic overviews of these perplexing structures. If you enjoy these videos that I make and work from similar creators, then you will find much value in Keith's work. So, that'll be all for now. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel for more ancient Egyptian content in this vein, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Ta-ra for now.